Guys, I'm Caleb Giddings, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about a topic that has been part of the firearms community, the self-defense community, for a very long time. It's also deeply misunderstood because there are a lot of people who just sort of get sound bites, for lack of a better word, about it. So today we're going to explore the history, the techniques, and the modern applications, if any, of point shooting. Now, the first question we want to ask is, what is point shooting? And very broadly speaking, point shooting is shooting a firearm, usually a handgun, and that's how we're going to apply this today. Shooting a firearm, a handgun in this case, without referencing a traditional sight picture. So that's kind of our broad strokes definition of what point shooting is. Now, when we're talking about point shooting, there's also three sort of types of point shooting that get commonly referenced. The oldest is what's called the Fairbairn-Sykes-Applegate technique, or FSA, and we'll talk more about all of these later. The next oldest, so more modern, I guess would be the term, is the FBI's half-hip or one-half crouch technique, and the most recent is what we're going to call the modern point shooting method, which is kind of best modeled by the combat focused shooting types. All right, now that we have a broad understanding of what point shooting is, let's talk a little bit about the history of point shooting and some of the justifications or reasons why point shooting was trained, why it was more common. And this takes us all the way back to the 1930s, to the interwar years, and the guys Fairbairn and Sykes, all right? They developed a technique for instinctive firing called the Fairbairn-Sykes method, which was later improved on by Colonel Applegate during World War II. Now, some of the reasons why they felt the need to develop this technique were, one, the sights on pistols in the 1930s were not great. And as an example, I have a pistol from the actual 1930s. This is a 1935 Beretta. This was, believe it or not, considered a service pistol, despite the fact that it's a 32 ACP, it's the size of the palm of my hand, and the sights on it are absolutely just trash. Trying to line a gun like this up and take a sight picture is extremely difficult, all right? So the first reason that people would point shoot is, well, the sights sucked. And when you have crappy sights, it's hard to get good hits. And another reason that the FSA technique developed sort of the way it did was because back then people shot with one hand. We hadn't quite yet figured out that this was a better way to get accurate hits on target than this. Two of the other common justifications for teaching point shooting as a technique is that people tend to get focused on the threat during dangerous encounters. That's just a part of human physiology. If something's trying to kill us, our natural instinct is to look at that thing that's trying to kill us, not look at the little nubbin of the front sight that we have on our gun. And as a matter of fact, guns are weird. Guns are the only thing, at least with traditional sighting methods, that require us to take our eyes off of the thing that's trying to kill us and look at it to do this weird geometry alignment while we're trying to defend our life. So people tend to get threat focused and they tend to want to look at the threat. And that was one of the justifications for point shooting. And the last one is this idea of pointing at stuff. And you've probably seen this online if you've done any sort of research about point shooting, about its history or anything like that, where people, advocates of point shooting, will say, well, if I want to point my finger at a lamp, I just point at the lamp, right? I don't need to line up the tip of my index finger with the back of my hand to successfully point at the lamp. And that's true, but it's also kind of a gross misunderstanding of how the human body works, and we'll get to that later. Okay, now that we have a bit of a historical understanding of the background behind point shooting and the reasons why it was developed, some of the justifications for it, let's go over the actual techniques of point shooting. Now, a couple of important principles of point shooting are that you will always remain threat focused, all right? We're not looking at the sights or the gun or anything like that. We're staying focused on the threat. And the first one we're going to talk about again is the oldest, the FSA technique, or the Fairbairn-Sykes-Applegate Now, this was originally developed for shooting with one hand, and as a matter of fact, the original manual refers to this as the one-hand gun, which I think is kind of cute and funny because it was the 1930s and we hadn't really figured out shooting yet. But how the FSA technique works in general, you start off with the gun in your dominant hand and you're going to have your elbow locked. And it specifically says this in the manual. You're going to have your elbow locked and you're going to have your the same foot as your gun hand actually forward in this stance, and then you'll raise the gun, and according to the manual, you'll actually interrupt your sight with the gun, your eye line with the gun. Now, this is important because this is actually a technique that we use in modern shooting as well, where we're using the gun as a gross aiming reference, all right? For like a 3-yard shot at a wide open target, I will actually just do that, and I'll throw the gun up in between my eye line and the target and use that as my gross aiming index. So with the FSA technique, again, if I'm right-handed, my right foot is forward, my elbow's locked and straight, and my support hand is here or here. One of the old manuals has it thrown out to the side like we're doing some kind of cool dance move or something like that. And then the gun, again, is brought straight up into my eye line, okay? So if I'm trying to pop this wall over here, it's straight up like that, and I stay focused on the wall. Now, that's important for the FSA technique. This technique is extremely dependent on having a good body position, all right? You have to have this very specific position. And as a matter of fact, in the handbook talking about it, they say that if you want to actually shoot at something else, like if you have to pivot, you have to turn your whole upper torso like a tank because your elbow is locked. This is your primary way of aiming the gun, is having your body locked in this specific position. All right, so we're just gonna, this is it right here. Looking at the threat, gun comes straight up, and I fire, just like that, all right? Now, the next technique that we're gonna talk about is, of course, the FBI half crouch. And for that, we're gonna switch to camera number 2 because I gotta get low. Now, with the FBI half crouch, what's important to remember is, again, this technique, like the FSA, is extremely dependent on having a good body position, all right? You have to have everything locked up the way the technique says, otherwise, you're not going to get very good hits. And so for the FBI half crouch, your foot position isn't as important. But again, like FSA, it's got your right side foot forward with if you're right-handed. The next thing you're going to do is you want to lock this elbow right here into your body, okay? So I'm going to have my elbow touching my rib cage almost, and this is lined up in here. And then what I'm going to do is, in all of the pictures, it has these guys with their arms out like a ballerina. I'm going to crouch, and this is how I'm going to engage. And the key to getting successful engagements from this half hip position is having my head over the gun. So I need to have my head literally centered over the gun, because this is what I'm using to steer the gun accurately, is my eye line. If the gun's floating out here, it's not going to follow in my eye line nearly as well as if it's centered directly under my eye line. So that is the FBI one-half hip technique. And now the last one of these that we're going to talk about, the last point shooting technique that we're going to talk about, is the modern point shooting technique. Again, the combat focused shooting kind of thing. And this is the only one that uses 2 hands on the gun. So it's probably the best just because you have more control over the gun, right? Now with the modern technique, they do something where they incorporate a startle response, essentially a great big flinch into their process of doing this shot. And the reason for that, the justification behind that, is that according to a bunch of videos of police shootings, how people respond to gunfire is they automatically go like this, okay? So what they've done is they've incorporated that into their response. And then in all the videos, in all the documents, in all of the demonstrations of this modern style of point shooting that I've seen, what they do is they do a super aggressive flinch, and they crouch down and they slam the gun out to full extension with locked elbows and with the head buried in between the shoulders like that. Again, still maintaining that threat focus. So again, it's flinch, and this is kind of your startle response and your shooting technique right there. That covers the 3 major point shooting techniques. Now, very briefly, we're going to talk about the modern method. I don't want to call it the modern technique because that already exists. That's Jeff Cooper's bag. And we're way past isosceles as well as shooters. We're going to call this the athletic technique of shooting. With the athletic technique of shooting, my support side foot is a little bit forward. My weight is biased forward on the balls of my feet. My knees are bent. This gives me the ability to move rapidly in a lateral direction, front or back, because I'm not locked out in anything. I try to keep my head up as much as possible. The gun comes straight out to the target, and I take a sight picture that's appropriate for the shot I need to make. You'll notice at no point are any of my bits locked. My elbows aren't locked. This elbow's not locked, all right? My elbows are soft, my knees are soft, and my shoulders are relaxed. I want to be as relaxed as possible when I'm shooting this gun because that means I can shoot the gun faster and more accurately. Now, this is a trained technique. You actually do have to practice this to be good at it. But now that we've gone over the athletic style of aimed fire, the Fairbairn-Sykes method, the FBI half crouch, and of course the modern point shooting system, we're gonna go take a look at some of the disadvantages. All right, so we've gone over all of the positions that are your traditional point shooting positions, all right? Now I wanna look at some of the drawbacks inherent to point shooting. And the first one is low accuracy. Even in the point shooting manuals, they mention that it's not an accurate method of engagement for precision shots, for shots beyond a certain distance, etc., etc. Some of the old point shooting training methodologies wouldn't have targets past 3 yards. So it's not a great method for getting accurate hits beyond what we would call a conversational distance. And even at that conversational distance, it's not going to be as accurate as actually using one of the aiming techniques to aim your gun. So those are some of the drawbacks. It is heavily dependent on a perfect body position. If I want to get really good hits with the Fairbairn-Sykes method, I have to have a perfectly locked elbow, perfect alignment, and the gun's got to come up exactly into my eye line just right, and everything has to stay perfect. It's not forgiving of imperfect body position, unlike aiming the gun with 2 hands on it, where I can fire an aimed shot standing on 1 foot like the Karate Kid, and as long as my sights are good and my trigger press is good, the round will go where I want it to go. That's not true about FBI half crouch, it's not true about Fairbairn-Sykes, and it's probably not true about the modernized point shooting method either. Another drawback of point shooting is that when you're talking about guns equipped with modern sights, like this 92D with a fiber optic front sight, or even more so, something like this Beretta APX with a red dot sight, point shooting doesn't offer a speed advantage over that. It certainly did over old 1930s, 1940s guns with craptastic sights. But over modern guns with good sights or red dot sights, it no longer offers that speed advantage. And over guns with red dot sights and people who know how to use iron sights better, it doesn't even offer the advantage of remaining threat focused. The last thing we want to talk about in terms of drawbacks to point shooting is this idea of I can just point at the target. And that actually fails when you imply a better understanding of human kinetics to it, because this, pointing with my hand, pointing with my finger, is very much a gross body motion, all right? It's a gross motor skill. Flapping your arms is a gross motor skill. Pointing my arm, major trunk movements, those are gross motor skills. The entire act of shooting a handgun, from manipulating the trigger to lining up the sights, to hitting the mag release or the slide release or running the slide over the top, that's all a fine motor skill. It is, like, anytime you're grasping, that's a fine motor skill, okay? And so the idea that you can point a gun just as reliably as you can point your hand fails, because sure, if I want to say I'm going to point at this door, I can point at this door right here, or this door behind me, because you can't really see this door. And I know I'm pointing at that door, sure. But what if I say I need to point at a 4-inch circle on that door? Can I absolutely say that I'm 100% pointing at a 4-inch circle on that door? What if I say I want to point at that door handle? I'm probably pointing at that door handle, but now what if I'm 15 yards away? The pointing thing breaks down because it's not a fine reference. And when we're shooting a gun, we are trying to perform a very fine action. We're trying to put a little tiny projectile in an area the size of my fist, because that's how we stop people from doing bad things. So this whole idea of I can just point my hand and thus just point my gun sort of fails when you actually apply it with an understanding of how the body works and how guns work. But I don't want you to take my word for all of this. So what we're doing now is we're going to go out to the range, and we're actually going to test this stuff on the range with a shot timer so we can get some real data from this instead of just having conjecture and talkie time. All right, guys, we are out at the range, and it is smoking hot out here today. But now that we've gone over the techniques and gone over some of the drawbacks, we're actually going to demonstrate them and explain why they're not optimal in this day and age. So I got a USPSA target. I've been doing some practicing shooting at this target. So it's all taped up though. You notice there's no bullet holes in here. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna start with a very simple demo. I'm gonna do 2 shots using each of the techniques, the Fairbairn Sykes Applegate FSA, the FBI low crouch, the modern point shooting, tactical turtle kind of thing. And then I'm gonna do 2 shots where I actually aim the gun using the sights, all right? To give the point shooting techniques the most possible chance to do well, we're gonna do this from 5 yards. So let's go to get to 5 yards. All right, here we are at 5 yards. I'm set up on my target. We're going to use a shot timer because we want to have objective data. Crazy, I know, right? So first up, I'm going to use the Fairbairn Sykes technique. So we're gonna get all set just like we demonstrated in the studio. Elbows fully locked, and I'm gonna fire 2 shots. Let's look at those hits. So the hits were pretty good. I've got 2 A's basically right on top of each other, and it took me 1.08 seconds to do that with a 0.62 first shot and a 0.46 second shot. Now, let's go back to 5 yards, and we're gonna try the FBI crouch. Hopefully, I'm going to move the camera a little bit so you guys can get a better look at this. All right. That took longer because you have to get in the crouch, tuck your elbow, make sure your head's over the gun like we talked about. And now let's look at our hits. So we have 1 good hit and 1 really peripheral hit, all right? This is a bad place to shoot somebody. It's not an effective place to shoot someone. All right, now last but not least, on the point shooting techniques, we're gonna try the modern style of point shooting, where we have 2 hands on the gun and we're using an aggressive crouched down stance. All right, so if we can wait for the Air Force to finish their flyovers, the modern style, I have a peripheral hit, and I have a pretty decent hit, and that took 1.05 seconds. So far, Fairbairn Sykes has actually been the best, because even though it was 1.08 seconds, I got the 2 really good hits with it. Now, we're gonna do it using the sights. Let's see what happens. Camera's over here now, still at 5 yards. Still have bullets in the gun. All right, using the sights. using the sights, just want to point out, using the sights was by far the fastest. Like, not even close. 0.79 seconds. First shot 0.55, second shot a 0.24, all right? So by using the sights, and look, I got 2 alphas using the sights. So the only technique that also got me 2 alphas was slower by 0.3 of a second. Now, 0.3 of a second may not seem like a long time, but it really is if the other guy is shooting at you and he's cracking 0.3 second splits. That's a whole extra bullet. So you tell me, what do you want to do? Now that we're done with the demo, we're going to go back to the studio and we're going to talk about the results of this in an environment where I'm not literally pouring sweat through my shirt and listening to gunfire. So as you can see, aiming the gun worked better. It was faster. It was more accurate with the exception of the FSA technique, which I don't necessarily think is indicative of how accurate point shooting is, but aiming the gun was faster and it was more accurate than all of the other point shooting techniques. And that's because when you train to aim the gun, you get pretty good at it, all right? And one of the things that we want to talk about is those principles of aiming. So when we're aiming the gun, there's a whole bunch of different ways to aim a pistol. And I think a lot of the time people get caught up on this old school NRA idea of like perfect alignment between the front and rear sights, equal height, equal light, and all of that stuff. And that's not necessarily accurate. The great practical shooter Brian Enos used to talk about sight picture with what is almost a Zen cone of shooting, where he said, see what you need to see. And that's talking about the sight picture. So what we're talking about here is we have several different principles of aiming when I'm aiming this gun. And the first is one that is common from the FSA technique, and we call it the backplate or the gross index. So for example, if I'm using an M9, like this blue gun, and I need to make a really fast shot at a really close target, I simply slam the gun up into my eye line and interrupt it, and as long as I have the hammer over the meat, I'm blasting, all right? That's your gross index. Now, some people might call that point shooting. You might not. I call it aiming because I'm using this as an aiming reference. The next principle of aiming the gun is something that will be familiar to anyone who is familiar with the modern technique as promulgated by Jeff Cooper, and it's called a rough or flash sight picture. And with that, I'm not necessarily getting equal height and equal light, but what I'm making sure is that the front sight and the rear sight look pretty good in relation to each other, and I'm firing the gun, and as soon as they look pretty good in relationship to each other again for the shot that I need to make, I'm firing the gun again. Now, it's important to note, you can actually do this sight picture with both eyes open while looking at the target, depending on how your sight's set up and depending on how your eyes work. I do this all the time. I've done it in force on force, I've done it in military qualifications, and I've done it in matches under pressure. And the idea here is I'm staying target focused, and as I'm looking at the target, I have a blurry sight picture that my brain kind of knows how to line up, so I can look at this target, line up that blurry sight picture, and still get good effect on targets. So you can stay target focused and still use traditional iron sights. Takes a little practice, but the practice is worth it. And then of course the last sight picture that we want to talk about is the traditional equal height and equal light, where I line up the tops and the backs of the front and rear sights, stare down the front sight post super hard, and make sure that there's equal light on either side of it, and take a precise shot. I use this sight picture too if I need to take really precise shots. Now, one thing that we do want to mention is with red dot sights, toss all of it, man. Look straight at the target, put the dot where you want the bullet to go, and send it! And that's why red dot sights are super cool, because they give you all the advantages of staying target focused with all the advantages of a really precise targeting system like you get on a nice target gun. The reason we spend so much time talking about these principles of aiming and accuracy is because accuracy is the king of fighting with a pistol, all right? There is a great misconception that you can just shoot people like all over the place, and that's not true. Our target zone on a human being to shut them down, to stop them from doing naughty stuff, is about the size of my fist, and it's right here in the high thoracic, and it's about right here in the face. The fist is about 4 inches, or, bigger if you've got giant hands, or smaller if you're Tyrion Lannister. But the point is that this idea that I can just like hose bullets at something and shoot somebody here and here and here, and that has the same effect as shooting them 4 times right here, is absolutely false. And it's something even the FBI talked about in their famous 9mm white paper, which we talked about last week. And if you click down here, you can go view that video. Shot placement is king when fighting with handguns. And we've discussed all these aiming points, and we're discussing accuracy, so we can go back to the range and actually look at the real world applicable accuracy of point shooting. All right, we're back out at the range. I'm still sweating to death, and we're going to demonstrate the next thing and why I don't like point shooting as a solution, and that's a lack of inherent accuracy. So what I've got here, I have a Yankee Cup target over my USPSA target. And the reason I have this USPSA target is so we can see where all these bullets go, because I guarantee they're not all gonna hit this. But we like to use the Yankee Cup target because it has a 4-inch thread. You know what else is 4 inches? The vital zone that you're trying to hit on a human being in a gunfight, all right? This is about the size of my heart and my aorta and all the goodies that I want to hit in the high center chest. It's about the size of the T-box in the face, that spinal brain juice box that you want to put a bullet in, okay? So this is what I want to be able to hit reliably and on command. So I've set up kind of an easy test. What I've done is I've set my par timer for 3 seconds, okay? 3 seconds from the low ready means I'm shooting about half-second splits because I'm going to shoot 6 shots. Now, one thing I want to tell you, in between each setup, I'm going to pause the film. I'm going to go reset the target with a fresh Bianchi target each time so you can see the effects of the different point shooting techniques. I'm going to shoot 6 shots, so I should shoot about a shot every half second. The reason we're using the half-a-second cadence is because that's what LAPD Metro Division trains their elite shooters to hit at. They want you to be able to get hits on command with half-second or better splits at a target about this size. So that's why we're using it. And we're going to go through all of the point shooting techniques, starting with the oldest, the FSA, and moving all the way up to a 4th demo where I aim the gun using the sights. 3 seconds at 7 yards, the most common gunfighting distance. All right, here we go. So first, Fairbairn-Sykes. And again, Fairbairn-Sykes is very dependent on you getting a perfect stance, having that locked elbow, your body all lined up, and everything looking the way you need it to look for this to work. I also, well, we'll see. We'll wait till I get back to the studio for this. So I have par time set for 3 seconds, 6 shots, 3 seconds, Fairbairn-Sykes. All right, well, not only did I not make the par time, that took 3.71 seconds. The hits were pretty rough. All right, so here we go. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hits. And you're going to say, but Caleb, those are all on the person. Yeah, but they're all bad hits. None of these would be a fight-stopping hit, all right? None of these would even really start the road to being a fight-stopping hit. So I'm going to reset this target, and then we're going to do the FBI crouch. All right, time to do the same thing, but with the FBI crouch this time. And hopefully we'll get some better hits. Because, again, I think that of the techniques, Fairbairn-Sykes probably is the one that makes the most sense, I guess. Because if you really get a good body lock... Oh, I had one in the chamber. If you get a good body lock, you can get okay hits with it. I didn't know I had one around there. All right, here we go. Back to 7 yards. I'm going to set this camera. This doesn't really feel like 7 yards. Here we go. I'm going to set this camera way over here, hopefully out of harm's way, while I do the Fibby crouch. All right, lock, elbow, head over gun, crouch. Still promised the par time. So my par time for that was 3 seconds, and that was 3:34. And now let's look at our bullet holes. Okay, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that's a problem because I'm liable for that bullet, right? In the real world where real people live, I'm responsible for whatever that bullet hits. You can't take those back, man. All right, so FBI Crouch was faster than Fairbairn Sykes in this instance, but worse accuracy, because at least with FSA, all of my stuff hit the silhouette. I'm gonna reset this target, we'll do modern. All right, time for the modern point shooting method, which uses at the very least a two-handed grip on the gun. I'm gonna get all set up over here. My range and distance from the camera. Get set up in a low ready, check to make sure we got bullets. We got bullets. That time I made the par. Thankfully, I made the par time with that 3-second par. But again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's not an acceptable level of accuracy. It just isn't. I don't know how I can explain it other than doing it for real and showing you the target like that. Anyway, I'm going to tape this one up. We're going to do aiming the gun, and then we're going to go back to the studio to talk about it. All right, we're back, and I have to be honest with you. I shot a run, and I didn't have the camera turned on, so it was wasted. It was all hits on the target. Now I have to do it again, and hopefully I can do just as well. So you can see there's some extra pasters. Anyway, all right, so we're going to go back to 7 yards. This time I'm using the modern athletic shooting stance that guys like Scott Jedlinski and Ernest Langdon and even myself all teach. And what we're trying to do here, again, is do 6 shots under 3 seconds, all hits, and see if we can't be better than we were point shooting the gun. All right, a little bit slower, but much, much better hits. I had one hit that I would consider unacceptable, okay? So this is one unacceptable hit because it's out of the 8-inch circle. I have 1, 2, 3 hits in the 4-inch, 2 in the 8-inch ring, and 1 slightly low hit because I slapped the trigger. And I did it in 268. So I was a half a second slower than the point shooting. But remember, with the modern point shooting, I had rounds completely miss the target. So those don't count. It doesn't matter how fast they were if they miss. We're not doing suppressive fire out here, people. All right, that's hot. I'm tired. I want to go back to the studio and have like a normal conversation where I'm not sweating. All right, so let's take a second to make sense of those results. Of the 3-point shooting methods, FSA, half hip, and modernized point shooting, the Fairbairn Sykes was the most accurate. And in my opinion, it was probably the best, and is probably the best, because of all of them, it actually references an aiming technique where you're going to interrupt your vision with the gun and you're going to use a gross aiming technique, all right? However, none of them were as good as aiming my gun. When I used a rough sight picture, because that's what I was using when I fired those 6 shots, I didn't have like a crystal clear front sight focus. I had a very rough sight picture. I got 3 hits in the black, 2 hits that were right next to the black, and then 1 just outside the 8-inch circle. The closest any of the other methods came to that was FSA, where I had 2 hits in the 8-inch circle, and then the rest of them were outside of the 8-inch circle, but still on the target. And I followed the protocols for all of these as closely as possible. With the FBI half hip, I had my head centered over the gun. With the modernized point shooting, I had an aggressive grip and locked elbows, and I did them the way you're supposed to do them. But the problem is point shooting breaks down as a first method. I think that there are situations where you may have to fire a gun without being able to reference the gun or the sights or some other aiming technique. Obviously, if you're grappling with somebody and you have to shoot somebody with a thumb pectoral index, I'm not really using the sights or the gun to aim here, but that's different. That's an extreme case. And the other thing too is if you train to use the sights and if you get good at using the sights, you'll be able to do all of that other stuff. I think part of the reason why I had success with FSA over the other techniques where you don't have a visual reference on the gun is because with FSA, I have that interrupting my eye line visual reference on the gun. So I was at least able to have a sense of where the gun was in relation to the target. With the modernized point shooting, and especially with the FBI half hip, the gun's just sort of floating out there, and I'm hoping by guess and by God that it's mostly aligned with the target. So this video isn't to poo-poo the idea of point shooting. Again, I think that there are legitimate real-world situations where you may need to fire a gun without referencing the gun or the sights as an aiming index. However, you don't need to specifically train for those, because if you specifically train to use the sights and you understand the principles of aiming, you understand precise sight picture, rough sight picture, and gross sight index or gross gun index or slide index or whatever you want to call it, you'll be able to use those on command in a stressful situation, assuming you spent the time to get good at it, all right? And that's the thing. I think point shooting is attractive because it gets presented as this thing anyone can do really easily. But I think it's actually harder to get good at point shooting than it is to get good at sighted shooting. And as you can see, when I aim the gun, I perform a lot better than when I don't. I'm Caleb Giddings. Thanks for watching.